美国战略收缩引发关键问题：地球是一个强国更稳定，还是多个强国共治更安全？
After the World War, II, the United States, basically after the downfall of Soviet Union, United States probably is the only one that's taking care of international affairs. So it's a unipolar system in the international order. Before that, multipolar system. So how do you compare with the two? Which one that will make a world more stable?
I think one has to also distinguish security from economics. So in the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union were the dominant bipolar security powers.
Yeah.
But I would have felt the world economy moved towards multipolarity in economics much earlier. Recovery of Japan, recovery of Europe, and then, of course, the big story being Chinese reforms and opening up playing a key role.
Yeah.
Now, after the end of the Cold War, the United States sought to maintain the alliance system for stability. But again, in economic terms, I think it was always multipolar, and China's a good example of this. So I gave a speech when I was at the State Department in 2005, where I urged China to become a responsible stakeholder, was the phrase. And the logic of that was that for 30 years, the U.S. policy had been to try to integrate opening China into the international system. By 2005, China was a member of the UN Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. It was part of international environmental agreements. And so what I was suggesting in 2005 was that because of China's accomplishments, the international system had helped China, but now China also needed to try to support.
Especially after WTO.
Yes, but and then that system was one that China had an interest in. But the system would have to adapt, and China would also have a role in that adaptation. Instead, the system moved more towards great power competition than a systemic one. So in a sense, there can be different models, but one also has to recognize that the system will change. For example, China of 2025 is very different than the China of 1970. My own view is sometimes people say globalization is in retreat. I don't think that's accurate if you look at capital flows and climate and oceans and biological security. But the governance of globalization has fragmented and created frictions.
President Trump could be an exceptional case. I'm asking if those underlying principles are still there. I mean, the U.S. working with European allies and to maintain the world order. So it might be, let's say, after 4 years, after President Trump, then the U.S. policy would swing back.
It's a possibility, but I think when Trump was reelected, it underscored that the disruptive nature of his policies. So let's take a couple of your examples. He believes that the European countries didn't pay enough for their defense. And so he has said NATO is protecting them, but not good enough for us. And over the past weeks, you've seen Germany and other Europeans said they'll pay more. That could go one of two ways. One is it could say, well, this is more fair, and it would support a future NATO. Or it could create a sense that Europe can't rely on the United States.
So they're going their own way.
Could be.
I mean, yeah.
So, and let's take the Asia context. As you know, because you've studied international affairs, in the 60s, there was a view that many more states would become nuclear powers. Because the United States provided a security umbrella, many countries did not develop nuclear weapons. But if, for example, the United States security commitment to South Korea is no longer reliable, 70% of the people in Korea want to have a nuclear weapon. If South Korea gets a nuclear weapon, and Russia and North Korea and China have nuclear weapons, what might happen in Tokyo? So the point is that, as your question suggests, this is a time of upheaval in the international system. The pendulum may swing back on some of these topics, but I think we're moving into an era now that is likely to be more like the great powers of 1900. The US, China, India, Russia militarily, not necessarily economically. Europe will determine whether it'll be more cohesive. This creates dangers about tensions between those powers. So the post-World War II system that the US created wasn't always perfect. The US made mistakes in Vietnam and in other areas. but it created a certain stability and economic opportunity. Trump is now going in a different direction. So in that sense, the history is useful to help you think of questions to ask. History doesn't move in a straight line. There's often cycles. Yeah?